I was just knocked out when I first started to read it because it just has so much more detail than anything else. Later grimoires have left this out, left that out, and so forth, but this one is just packed with useful information.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today is an unprecedented esoteric update with author, scholar, and grimoire practitioner, Dr. Stephen Skinner. After nearly 700 years, one of the most important Western magical compendiums in history has been fully translated into English for the first time. The Summa Sacre Magice, or SSM, is a 200,000-word Latin manuscript written in 1346 by Catalan magician Berengarii Gannellii, and is considered the most in-depth overview of Latin medieval magic ever. The SSM fills in so many lost, unknown, or underemphasized gaps in Solomonic magic. If you practice the Lemegeton's Goetia or the Heptameron, you will find key nomina magica and spirit names in the SSM from hundreds of years before. If you call spirits from the four directions based on the Book of Raziel, you will find these names with earlier spellings in the SSM. If you are looking for incredibly detailed conjurations of the spirits of the seasons, planets, zodiac, winds, or if you're seeking new insights into the infernal hierarchies and the grimoires, you will find them in the SSM. And in a stunning achievement, scholar, author, and Solomonic practitioner, Dr. Stephen Skinner is presenting Volume 1 of his 2-volume translation of all 5 books of the SSM into English, along with his co-author, Daniel Clark, this being presented through Golden Horde Press. This translation is the most significant full translation of a Western magical text since Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, if not ever. And we are always so honored when Dr. Skinner returns on Glitch Bottle, and today he's going deep, sharing about this incredible work for the first time. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Dr. Stephen Skinner. Dr. Stephen Skinner, thank you so much for taking your time and returning on the podcast today.
It's such a pleasure to be here talking with you, particularly about this particular manuscript, which I was just knocked out when I first started to read it, because it just has so much more detail than anything else. Later grimoires have left this out, left that out, and so forth, but this one is just packed with useful information.
This is stunning, but frankly not surprising when it comes to you and tackling big projects. And Dr. Skinner, magicians and authors like the wonderful Munich-based Frater Acher were writing more than a decade ago, expressing a hope that intrepid scholars like yourself would be so bold as to undertake a full translation of the SSM, and you have. And I know that you've translated some hefty works before, but nothing, I assume, compares to translating the Summa Sacre Magice, or SSM. So can you share with us, Dr. Skinner, when and how, indeed, did you first start working on this massive undertaking?
Well, I first became aware of it, I suppose, about 17 years ago. And I thought, wow, that sounds very interesting. I hope somebody else translates it so I don't have to. For the last 17 years, there's been people saying, yes, we're going to do that. Damaris Gear said she was bringing out an edition, but it never happened. And I can understand why it never happened. This is one hell of a large, detailed Latin manuscript. In the end, after my co-author, Daniel Clark, drew my attention back to it and said, why hasn't somebody done this? I decided to settle down and actually translate it. And that, thank God, has been done.
That is incredible, Dr. Skinner. This is, 200,000 words stretching for dozens and dozens of chapters over 5 books. Can you share with the listeners, is your translation a full translation, and is it based on a specific manuscript?
That's a slightly tricky question. The base answer is yes, it's based on the Cassel manuscript, which is very beautiful to look at, and which I got a digital copy and started to work my way through it. However, it is known that 96 folios were ripped out of this sometime after 1600. Fortunately, before then, somebody made a German translation of it. And so the missing bits will be supplemented from the German manuscript. But the core manuscript's the original one, which is in Latin, and which is the one kept in Cassel.
The Cassel manuscript has had quite a history. In fact, John Dee once owned this manuscript. Is that correct?
Well, it goes back even further than that. Trithemius owned it and had it in his private library. And we'll talk later about what Trithemius said about it. But when he left his library and went to a new abbey, the people left behind presumably sold it. And then it fell into John Dee's hands somewhere around about 1580. And he valued it very highly because from it, he took diagrams which later become the main diagrams of Enochian magic. The Sigillum Emet is in fact originally from this book, this volume, the SSM. So it is actually the root then of a lot of stuff that Dee did and a lot of stuff that Enochian magic's carried on afterwards. Therefore, going back and reading the original text is truly amazing because there's a lot more said there than has ever been revealed since. And I had to go one step further. So after Dee acquired it, on his way back to England, he, I suspect, ran out of money and needed to have replace his coaches and horses. And so he sold it, Hesse Cassel, for what must have been a reasonably sizable amount of money because he bought over half a dozen horses and a couple of carriages with that money and then proceeded back to England. But it must have broken his heart because this book, Summa Sacre Magice, is the most complete volume on magic that either Dee had seen or indeed that I have seen since then. And then it sat untouched in the library with the exception of the German translation from it, which is where it still is. So it hasn't changed hands in 400 or 500 years. But likewise, nobody has read it and nobody has used it again. And although Damaris Gear transcribed it 17 years ago, nobody has used that transcription since. And so I thought, okay, the time has come for it not to remain asleep on the shelf of that library, but it needs to be in English and it needs to be used because it is very solidly practical magic.
And here you are, Dr. Skinner, doing the detective work that you always do. 96 folios, as you say, were ripped out of the Cassel manuscript, and you use that German manuscript to kind of supplement and fill in the gaps. And your translation, your full translation of the SSM, could be considered the most important translation of an esoteric Western text from Latin into English since Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Can you expand on what you just shared about why is the SSM considered one of the most important compendiums of all time with Western magic?
In a few words, because it's the most comprehensive. It covers many of the different techniques of magic in detail. It gives a larger number of phenomena magica. It explains more and enlightens one much more because the grimoires that came after it were written by practicing magicians who just bothered to write down the things they probably couldn't remember. Nobody actually sat down to write a complete beginning to end of magic, whereas Berengarii Gannellii had obviously decided that he was going to include everything And he was extracting it from older manuscripts, which apparently don't exist anymore, or if they do, they're deeply buried in some library where the librarian has not catalogued their name in quite the same way. One of the facts of Western magic is that the knowledge was not passed in secret societies, hand to hand, mouth to ear, but it was primarily passed via manuscript, so that a master would give his manuscript to his pupils and so on. So Ganelli summarized probably 5 other manuscripts, which apparently don't exist anymore. And so his is the most complete summary of Western magic still extant. And of course, when the 3 books of occult philosophy came out, written by Henry Cornelius Agrippa, he attempted to bring together everything that he could find. And where was he working? He was working in Trithemius's library. So you have a line of descent from the SSM through various magicians, and then through Trithemius, and then from Trithemius to D, and from D to more modern grimoires. But I've always wanted to get back to the origin of these. And I wanted to know what, for example, the famous Kandaris are. They were particular talismans. But the SSM, Summa Sacre Magice, doesn't just say what they were or give drawings of them, which are reproduced in my book, but it actually dismantles them and says what each of the letters in the talisman actually is. That is truly amazing, and how to write them and draw them. And so there's bits of information like this that just have not been mentioned in print, and possibly not even in some manuscripts since then. So that's why I was really thrilled to do the hard work. And believe me, it was hard work on this manuscript, the largest and probably the oldest extant book of Western magic.
Broadly speaking, Dr. Skinner, too, can you share, this is such a massive compendium, how are the 5 books of the SSM, stretching more than 200,000 words, 800 folio pages, how is this structured? What is the layout of the 5 books?
Well, it's divided up into about 86 chapters. The first part is really a recitation of many of the magical names for periods, winds, etc. And so the first part is a little bit boring to actually read because it's long lists. But these lists become very valuable later when you read the later parts of the SSM, which tell you how to use them. So how is it structured? Well, it's quite logical. There will be chapters on planetary spirits, chapters on the days of the month, chapters on the mansions of the moon, chapters on the 7 planets, chapters on the garments that you wear as a magician and how they should be made, etc., etc. So it's quite detailed. One of the pleasures of translating it is I came across the answers to questions that had come up in my head while I was translating other stuff. Well, why didn't they say what that was, or how was that done, or when was that used, or where was it put? And these details are in the SSM.
Very little is known about the author and compiler of the SSM, Berengarii Gannellii. We know that he was a well-educated magician from the Catalonian region between Spain and France, living in the 1300s. But what else can you tell us about Ganelli?
Well, he lived in the border town between Spain and France, Perpignan, which is not such an important town now, but it was then. Perpignan also was the rulership of the Balearic Islands, and it was also an area of cross-culture because it was where material went from France south to Spain and vice versa. And in those days, Spain had a proportion of Arab-speaking people. And there was also a proportion of Jews, Hebrew writing and speaking. There was the remains of the Hellenic culture, so Greek writing, which then had formed part of the Byzantine Empire. And of course, there was Latin. So there was 4 main languages. And instead of just concentrating on one or the other, Ganelli, who probably could read and write all four languages, gives details from each of these cultures and gives them in each of these languages. So his major table of practice actually has these four alphabets, one on each side: Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And so it was much more diverse than any of the later grimoires. And he gave due respect to the elements that came in from each of these directions. So it was truly a universal grimoire. Of course, there's some languages that aren't there, but that's because they were not there in that part of Europe. Now, several people have said, oh, he must have been from the Middle East or somewhere like that. But no, I can tell you exactly that he was from a castle southeast of Perpignan, and there are several references to him owning even older grimoires, such as the Juratus. No key of Solomon, but there was definitely Juratus and several other earlier ones. Some of these information has been built into the SSM. But basically, the SSM is a freestanding four-culture grimoire covering just about anything you'd want to know. And so, from that point of view, it was exhilarating to translate, but it was also horrendous in some ways, because you came across stuff that, like the strap and the crown and pieces of ritual equipment, which don't really feature very heavily in later grimoires. But it covers them and what they're made of and how to use them.
You've mentioned, Dr. Skinner, before, of course, many grimoires, were written by Solomon or pseudo-Solomon. Ganelli is noteworthy as at least one of the first people in the medieval West to put his real name to an esoteric work in 1346 instead of using a pseudonym. Can you share about this, and why is this so significant?
Well, first of all, he must have been very brave, because the church was quite strong in those days, and to stand up and say, I know about real magic, and I've written its largest textbook. It was just asking for trouble. He didn't get trouble, fortunately, but he did get into one court case for having apparently hexed one of the locals. I can't remember the outcome, but he walked away at the end. So he had the reputation, and yet he wasn't hiding. So he put his real name out there. And in my book, I've gone into some depth as to what his real name was, which is slightly different from the one that the academic record speaks about at the moment, but we won't go into that. And at the same time, he put his real date, or in fact, John Dee discovered his date and wrote 1346 at the front of this SSM volume, because he found that reference much, much later. Dee read the whole thing through from beginning to end, because, of course, for him, Latin was easy, because he was using it all the time. And then from it, extracted things that he would find useful. So I have to say, I would have been, if I was Dee, I would have been gobsmacked to have to leave it behind. But it was his ticket to leave Europe with at least some money in his pocket, because constantly traveling around and talking to many people was an expensive hobby. Well, for Dee, it wasn't a hobby, it was serious.
In the introduction of the SSM, Ganelli opens by saying that magic is, and he uses various phrases, quote, the science of binding evil and good spirits by the use of the name of God. And then elsewhere, magic is a science of words. And then elsewhere, magic deals with wonder-working words, unquote. Can you share, what are these words, and why is this the main focus, or one of the main focuses of Ganelli's work?
Well, it's the main focus of actually anybody dealing with magic, because magic doesn't work without invocation. The invocations need to be said, so the spirits, good and evil, will actually turn up. When they turn up, they need to be bound, otherwise they just trick you, and then compelled to carry out whatever it is you wanted done. Now, magic can't do all sorts of magical things. There's a very clear limit to what magic can do, but it's much larger than what just wishing can do. Wishing is not a very scientific thing, but magic is. you use the right words, and you say them at the right time, you get the right spirit, and you tell it what you need it to do, and you bind it to do that. Anything else, it might be magical, but it's not really magic. I'm sure that some of my listeners will at this stage scream, oh, what about this magic and that magic and so on? These indeed manifest things and so forth, because occasionally you get lucky and a spirit happens to be passing and will do what you've asked it to do. But if you want to be certain that it will do it and do it with the amount of detail that you want, then you need to use the right words and you need to bind it. Now, most of the later grimoires just mention binding in passing. One of the beauties of the SSM is that it has several chapters on how the binding is done. So this is really concrete magical information.
You just mentioned a few moments ago, Dr. Skinner, a very famous person in Western esotericism, the mentor of Agrippa, of course, the Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius. And Trithemius references the SSM in his 1508 work, known to many listeners, the Antipalus Maleficorum. Trithemius depicts the SSM as a collection of, quote, fatuous, superstitious, and frivolous doctrines. And he says that Ganelli is, quote, a soldier of the demons rather than of God, end quote. However, can you share, Dr. Skinner, how this is a gross distortion, perhaps, of Ganelli?
I'm glad you brought that one up. In fact, it is exactly what Trithemius said when he wrote it in the Antipalus. But Trithemius, being an abbot, had to be very careful about his own security. He had powerful friends, and if he'd been grabbed by the Inquisition, they might have been able to bail him out, but he had to protect himself. And his very clever method was to condemn in great detail and with strong language any book on magic. So he was then able to produce a catalogue of all the best and most useful books on magic, which was the Antipalus Maleficarum, and have it published. It was printed actually in, 1508, which is truly amazing because anybody else who'd published a list of classical works on magic would have been immediately grabbed by the Inquisition and wouldn't have seen the light of day again for the rest of their life. But Trithemius's technique was very clever. He condemned these in print. But if you read his condemnations, you can see that he's really saying, yes, this is a terrible, outrageous, anti-Christian, horrible manuscript, but it's very good. So the Antipalus can be actually used as a reading list of the best manuscripts of magic prior to 1508. Trithemius didn't even include one or two of his own works, which were completed by that point. So that was his technique. So you just don't take his words about the books at face value. So jumping ahead to my next project, which I didn't intend to do, but maybe we can talk about it at some later point, was an edition of his Antipalus Maleficorum. And it is a list of 103 magical manuscripts that Trithemius had in his personal library. And almost all of them are heavily abused, which is his protection technique. And then there are little hints as to what they are useful for. And so that becomes, for a lot of people, a reading list. And in fact, it's the reading list that I selected some of the books that I've translated and published since. The first book on his list is, in fact, The Key of Solomon. And I think that the SSM becomes his 8th book, but he also includes the Juratus and a number of others. So reading that will give you clues as to where the subsequent grimoires that are worth reading are. What I did as well was to add in details of where those manuscripts currently are, because some of them appear to have just disappeared, but others are hidden away under innocuous titles in sundry libraries around Europe and the rest of the world. So much for SSM's condemnation by Trithemius. but he had his tongue firmly stuck in his cheek while he was saying it.
Dr. Skinner, before we get to the SSM and the specific, the techniques, the nomina magica, things like that, you've publicly shared here on Glitch Bottle and elsewhere about practicing, for example, the Lemegetans Goetia in years past, and also testing the techniques of the Ars Notoria and others. Can you share if you have, as you were translating this and finalizing it, if you've experimented or incorporated some of the techniques of the SSM into your existing practice?
Well, I don't think I'd have been able to translate this all the way to the end without actually testing it. And yes, I have not tested many of the techniques in there because there are a lot, but I've applied some of the methods and added some of the techniques to what I normally do and find that they work quite well. So this is truly a practical book and not a theory book. And in fact, one of my enthusiastic supporters once said to me, the next book you write, please don't put any history in there. We don't want it. Just put in technique. Well, I'm glad you laughed, because you appreciate that part of the process of translating it, you have to figure out what the history was so you know what was going on around the author at the same time. And I find the background and history a little bit fascinating. So I decline to drop the history out of future books.
And we are also grateful that you do keep the history in. I love that, because like yourself and David Rankin and a very, very select few others, you balance so well the scholarly investigations, but also the practical application of the Solomonic techniques. Actually, something I share with listeners all the time is, of course, referencing the 6-step Solomonic method that you've touched on and you've codified, as well as David Rankin. Many magical rituals in the SSM, regardless of spirit class, seem to follow a rough sketch of your 6-step Solomonic method, which, as a quick refresher for listeners, of course, there's effectively consecratio Dei, fasting, prayers to God, preparing ritual implements, invocatio, evocatio, and then, of course, the binding and issuing a charge and dismissing of the spirit. And these steps that you've shared about before are similar to steps in the 4th book and in your own writings. Did this similarity in sequential steps, Dr. Skinner, in the SSM, did this surprise you, or was this just confirming your experience of what you practice?
Even ignoring what I practice, the similarity of the steps is that these are the steps that you need to do to get to the end. So, for example, if we were talking about cookery, you need to, put the flour in the pan and add milk or whatever and stir, and then butter, and et cetera, et cetera. If you do it the other way round and you start with an empty plate or something and you put the ingredients in but you don't heat them, you're not going to finish up with a cake or even with edible food. So this outlines the fact that any scientific or practical application needs to have sequential steps, and you need to use those steps. So, for example, and this is true across all cultures, so if you wanted to cast a sword, if you're doing it in Japan, you would need to heat the fire up to whatever it is, 1400 degrees, add in the metal, and then after it's cast, you need to beat it and then heat it again, etc., etc. And these steps, you can't just leave them out, otherwise you finish up with a sword that is fragile, and the first time it hits anything, it shatters. You need to do the steps properly. And the same thing is true of magic. Because magic is a technique, a science, and the Greeks talked about it as a techne, meaning a technical procedure. So you do the steps in the correct order. If you start by binding something which hasn't arrived yet and then calling on it, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to use the sequence. So this sequence that you referred to, the 6 steps of Solomonic magic, are the ones that I summarized in the appendix of techniques of Solomonic magic, strangely enough. And in the appendix, it's explained in detail what they are and what order they should be done in. And if you don't do that, then you're not really doing magic, and you probably won't succeed except by some kind of pure accident.
And to follow that point, Dr. Skinner, in one of your other previous tomes, The Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic, you so wonderfully make the distinction between magic and religion, and going all the way back to the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, where you say that magical operations are normally small, private, and the operator, as you say, uses nomina magica and words to constrain spirits, while religion is the opposite. It's public. It involves large groups of people gathering in a specific location and asking the god or gods, begging them for favors. So when it comes to the SSM, Dr. Skinner, can you share, how does Ganelli treat the divide between religion and magic?
Well, first of all, Ganelli doesn't really speak about religion in any kind of detail. I've been trying to figure out whether he was a Jew or a Christian. He certainly wasn't a Muslim, because in fact, Islam came somewhat later. But leaving that aside, he sees some of the benefits of religion, like the presence of God and archangels and angels, as part of the usable machinery. So before doing a magical ritual, he needs to align with his God. And he's very clear. He says, you don't have to align with my God. You have to align with your God. He even says, well, if you're Jewish, you do this technique from right to left. And if you're Christian, you do it from left to right. And that's just not the writing direction, but it's all sorts of things that should be done in a certain way. So he leaves that open. So he's not laying Christianity on top of magic or on top of any operator. He's saying that you can use the basic religious background to consolidate yourself before you start. But then after that, he ceases to talk about praying or begging and talks about invoking and calling and binding, which is the magical operation. And this is not a religious operation. I think a lot of religious folk would be a bit horrified. In fact, I get letters sometimes telling me, well, you can't bind spirits, you can't compel them to do things. And my answer is, if you are trying to tame a horse, you need to bind it, you need to tie it up, you need to compel it. You can't just feed it sugar lumps. It needs to feel a little bit of the stick as well. And it needs to be repeatedly gone over and over something until it does it automatically. And that's teaching a horse. But a spirit also needs discipline. So you've got to use the right formula, the right words to ensure that it does what it's told every time. And I offer no apology for that.
Absolutely not. Indeed, Dr. Skinner. And by the way, as you've shared on this podcast before, even if you're engaged as the gentleman magicians of the Janua Magica Reserata in England, say in the 1650s, are engaged in celestial or super celestial operations, even when it comes to angelic beings, while they may not be bound in the same way as, say, a sublunar spirit, the nomina magica and following the sequential steps and using those powerful names to encourage and coerce a spirit is critical, right? I mean, this is an absolute method.
Indeed. It's like you can't tame a horse if you don't put a bridle on it, or at least tie it to a rope and force it to walk around in a civilized way. You can't just stand there and shout at it, hey, horse, do this, do that. Take no notice at all. And likewise, if you stand in the middle of a circle and shout at spirits, they will also not take any notice unless you use the right words and the right binding formula.
The SSM, Dr. Skinner, also mentions, broadly speaking, two traditions that Ganelli shares about. There's the ars vetus, or the ancient art, which Ganelli says is effectively based on the Old Testament. It might be considered imperfect. And then there's the ars nova, or the new art, which is, Christian focused. Does this distinction play much of a practical role in the SSM? It sounds like no.
The answer is definitely no. In some ways, I think this has been accentuated by academics looking at it. There isn't a big distinction between Old Testament and New Testament, just as Ganelli is happy to accept that you can use a Jewish formula or an Arabic formula. So as long as you're using a formula that has a structure and has a tradition, it's okay. So he's not a very religious person. I think if I was standing in front of a firing squad and told that I had to decide what religion he belonged to, I would have some difficulty in doing that. I suspect he was probably Jewish and possibly converted to Christianity, but I couldn't be certain. I think he had a lot of affection for Greek pagan thought as well.
Dr. Skinner, would it be fair to say that Ganelli's outlook seems to also be similar to the original author of the Juratus, the Sworn Book of Honorius, who says, yep, oh, this is a pagan circle, but if you're a Christian, here's what you should, there's a distinction of different groups.
Yeah, you throw in a few extra words. He's just much more universal. He is not hedged in with particular religious commands or even framework. He's happy to talk about angels and also talking about demons, because they're both sublunary creatures, i.e. creatures under the moon, creatures that occupy the space between heaven and earth and can be bitten and compelled using the same sort of formula.
This is a great time to chat about the sources of the SSM and some of the source works that Ganelli was drawing from. And one of the main sources is a now lost text called the Magica, which was a 7-book tome devoted to techniques for summoning spirits and angels. And it was one of the most thorough pseudo-Solomonic texts circulating in Europe between the 12th and 14th centuries. Can you share any thoughts on this now lost pseudo-Solomonic manuscript, Dr. Skinner?
Well, I'd perhaps better share a few thoughts on pseudo-Solomons. Although most of the later grimoires talk as if it was Solomon, the Jewish king, some of them just talk as if it was Solomon, the rabbi, or just Solomon. But it's only in the SSM that Ganelli actually points to a particular Solomon who lived in I can't remember, it was the 11th or 12th century, and who wrote some of these books, which he credits with as being his source. So for him, Solomon was a relatively recent 200-year back magician, rather than talking about the Israeli Solomon.
So Ganelli was looking at this text, the Magica, and just like looking at the Sworn Book of Honorius, was incorporating these sources into his compendium, the SSM.
Yeah, and he's quite honest about that. He says, look, I took this quote, and he's specific. This is exactly what that Solomon said in his book Magica in volume 5 or volume 7 or whatever. So if I was ever able to find these much older magical texts, then I could correlate what the SSM has pulled together. One of my projects is to look back and see if I can find these older books, because manuscripts usually finish up in libraries or in private collections. They don't often get thrown away because they were known to be valuable. But the trouble with magic is that when people were keeping magical manuscripts, they couldn't just say, oh, this is a magical manuscript, so they had to label them as something slightly different, so that when the Inquisition turned up and were looking at their catalog, they didn't go, oh, look at that, what's that? Show me, blah, blah, blah.
Dr. Skinner, in terms of those source works that Ganelli was drawing from, the Magica text, it references a vital tradition called the Semaphorus or the Semaphorus tradition. This is such a key thing when it comes to the nomina magica, when it comes to the importance of names. Can you share with us, Dr. Skinner, what is this Semaphorus tradition, and why are the construction of word tables and extracting names so critical for Ganelli, and even to the point that I believe he says, quote, the advanced magician can reduce the entire practice to their use, end quote. That's very significant.
Well, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. He was trying to emphasize how important they were. But that provided me with a minor translational problem, because he talked about extracts taken from these tables. And the extracts he referred to in Latin as semaphores. Well, of course, in modern English, a semaphore is somebody waving a flag around rather than a piece of magical text. So these semaphores appear throughout the book, so they're quite important from that point of view. And the semaphorous tables then get built up into almost works of art, which are tables of these names in the correct corner and the correct side, etc. Because in magic, direction is very important. As I've often said before, if a spirit is located in the northwest and you face the southeast and call upon it, not only will it not come, it will be insulted because you're standing there with your back facing to it. And I suppose spirits don't have quite that sensitivity, but it's certainly true that you've got to call the spirit from the direction in which it lives, to use Ganelli's term. So the semaphore tables are indicative of the direction in which you should call individual spirits. And there are a couple of other tables which are not actually in SSM, but I have put in there so that readers will not be confused. One of them is the table of the major thrones in Tartarus, and the direction there is very important. So, for example, if you are attempting to call Beelzebub, then you need to look to the southeast, or whatever direction it was, can't remember offhand, rather than, say, calling him from the north. So these are all directional sensitive. My most recent book, the Steganographia, actually gave very detailed directions for each of the 70 or 80 spirits that it listed in there. So it's surprising that something that is non-material is sensitive to direction. It's sensitive to the words you use. It's sensitive to the names that you use. You can get the name slightly wrong, like I will respond to Stephen or Steve or Stefan. All these I'll recognize as me. And so some of the spirits, even when their name is mispronounced, will respond. But you can't then call the spirit Jack because it just will not respond. Just as if you call me Jack, I won't respond either. So just summarizing some of the points, it's the direction is important, the names are important, and the other thing that's important is time. So in Solomonic magic, the day is important. If you want to call a moon spirit, Monday is going to be a much better day to call it on than, say, Saturday. And in addition to the day, the actual hour. So the first hour and the 8th hour are good if you want to call a spirit who belongs to that particular day. So the first hour of Sunday is very good for calling a sun spirit. The first hour of Monday is good for calling a moon spirit, and so on. But throughout the day, these hours change. And so you could find that for some operations, you may need to choose the day of Mercury, but the hour of Saturn. And that will give you an edge, you call it, at that time. And that particular spirit that falls into that description will be much more likely to come. And when people say, well, why should the spirits be so time-centric? I give as an example, if you want to see the doctor and you turn up at his surgery at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, your chances of seeing him are 0. If you turn up at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, they're still not good. But at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, yes, they'd be a lot better. So the spirits are even more precise than that. And so you have to make sure that you've got the right day and the right hour. Otherwise, you're just working uphill. With magic, you don't want to work uphill. You want to work, as it were, with the flow. So time is important, and direction is important, and naming is important. If you get the names right, you get the direction right, and you get the timing right, then the chances are much greater that the spirit will actually turn up for you. Obviously, once it's turned up and been bound, then of course it will come much more easily next time. But you have to do that initial operation properly to make it work.
Yes, I was just telling David Rankin, we were chatting, and I said, I couldn't find it, but I said, I know Dr. Skinner in The Mysteries of Magic has a footnote where you say that, hey, this is a pretty rare thing that's not usually mentioned in the grimoires, but in The Mysteries of Magic, for example, it mentions that when you first call a spirit, instead of asking it to do, a bunch of different things, you effectively only conjure it for a binding. And then you say, the next time that I call you, may you come quickly and execute my will. So it seems like, that initial binding is very, very specific.
And you can almost say the same thing about employing somebody. The first time you interview them, you don't immediately pass a computer to them and a stack of tables and tell them to work it out. You talk to them. You make sure that they will come back on Monday morning, and that they will work for you, and you will pay them X amount. So this works for a lot of things. It also works for horses, except you're talking a bit more abstractly.
This is a great time to talk about some of the grimoires that listeners are very familiar with, like the Heptameron and the Lemegeton's Goetia, and sharing about how those key elements are found in the SSM. And so one of the examples, this just popped into my head, but I know it's something you've spent a ton of time translating. In the Heptameron, we have what I colloquially refer to as the Ovos Omnes section, where you say, by the name of the sun in the autumnal season, and the moon and the earth, and by these specific seasonal names. Well, can you share, Dr. Skinner, about in the Heptameron, you have the sun, the moon, and the earth. The SSM, this Ovos Omnes section, gets expanded to a surgical level of precision. Zodiacal signs, specific names of the directions, specific names of the directions in the season, the winds. I mean, can you share about this precision?
So the SSM goes in at a much more physical level than the later grimoires. And not only does it need to get the time right, but it also needs to get the season right. And you can see this on some of the later Key of Solomon, where the names written in the circle change according to what season you're in. There are, of course, 4 equal seasons in a year. What the cutoff point is from one season to the next used to be the 24th, but now it's much closer to the 21st or the 20th. But anyway, as the seasons change, so do various conditions change, and also the spirit hierarchy changes. And so if you are calling some autumnal spirit and you're doing it in high summer, this is not going to do very well. It's much better to do it in its own season. And so not only the seasons have to be right, but also another point is the winds have to be right. So, as everybody knows, Agrippa says you can't invoke in a stormy weather with very windy things happening or a lot of disturbances in the physical world. And the reason is because the physical world also affects the spiritual world. As the spirits are sublunar underneath the moon, between the moon and the earth, so they're affected by windstorms. Anybody who's tried doing an invocation during a thunderstorm will know that it's not only is it very unreliable, most of it doesn't work, but it can also give you results which you would not have expected. But basically, it's not a good idea. So to refine it even further, you need to use the names. If you're calling on the sun, you need to call the name of the sun in autumn, during autumn, the name of the sun in winter, during winter, and the name of the sun in spring, during spring, and so on. So you just don't say, I hereby call the sun, I hereby call Helio, or I hereby call whatever one of the other names is relevant. And so you get a precision of working. This is not the same as astrological precision. Because, and this is another big topic, there are 2 main types of magic in Europe and indeed the Western world. One is the one that depends upon spirits, which is what I'm always talking about because it's one that I know and use. And the other one depends upon astrology. It takes into account very refined astrological calculations. Is this planet in combust? Is this planet in opposition to the sun? Is this planet in conjunction with the moon, etc., etc.? That is a completely different form of magic, and it's one that's actually declined over the last 400 years until being resurrected again in the last 20 or 30 years by enthusiasts. But anyway, the method is completely different, and it is not Solomonic. It is a completely different system of magic, and I don't normally talk about it, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore tonight. But so the point is that the physical world has an effect on the spiritual world. You cannot invoke a gentle Venusian spirit if there's a motherable storms happening outside or there's a forest fire nearby. These things will completely disturb not just the physical world, but also the spiritual world.
Very much appreciate that context, Dr. Skinner. And to give listeners another connection between well-known grimoires and the SSM, in the 1559 Heptameron, for example, we find angels to call from the north, south, east, and the west for each day of the week. We also see semaphoras, words at the end of the vinculum Salomonis in the Heptameron, like, va, va, va. And some listeners might say, what are these words? Where do they come from? Can you share about how these very names of spirits from the north, south, east, and west, and also these nomina magica, are found 200 years before in the SSM?
Yeah, many, many words are found in the SSM. You can actually track back most of the important magical words to the SSM. Not all of them, of course, but most of them. And so from that point of view, it's very useful because instead of just being told these are the words you use, you are told when these words are used and why these words are used. So in lots of ways, the SSM is very scientific. Scientific in the sense that it uses particular procedures to achieve specific responses from the spiritual world and then also to have really physical effects. Because magic is not magic if it can't affect the physical world. That's one of the real reasons for doing magic, is you want to make changes in external circumstances. Anybody who thinks that they might just use magic to improve their life over the next 6 months is not really talking about magic, talking about adjusting their psychology.
Dr. Skinner, as well, you touched on this just a few moments ago, hinting at it, but when it comes to the SSM, there's also fresh, new insights in terms of the infernal hierarchies. And many listeners, of course, are familiar with the demon kings of the 4 cardinal directions that you detail, for example, in techniques of Solomonic magic, so Orion, Zamaimon, Paimon, and Agan. But very importantly, the SSM provides new and expanded information, new to listeners, about the infernal hierarchies. So, for example, it links in the SSM the 7 kings of the air we find in the Heptameron, so Varkan Rex, Sarabotres Rex, etc., as instead of being under Orion, Zamaimon, Paimon, and Agan, they're actually under 4 separate kings, Beel, Modil, Laber, and Enil. And those are in turn, as you've shared, underneath the demon king Beelzebub, who sits on the throne of genealogia. There are some different spellings, but given all that, how does the SSM fill in these vital gaps to our understanding of the infernal hierarchies, for example?
So the infernal hierarchies are also directional. And to know which direction you should be working in or what direction a particular spirit is located in, you need to know where the various sedes are located in Tartarus. Of course, Tartarus is not the same as hell. It's frequently confused with hell. Hell, if you happen to be a Christian, is where bad Christians finish up. But Tartarus is not for humans. Tartarus is the abode of the spirits. And in Tartarus, there are 7 major thrones and a few minor ones. And knowing the 7 thrones and what direction they're located in is very useful. And the SSM gives the full structure of Tartarus and the various demons and angels in each direction. However, you might ask why 7? Because in most divisions, there are in fact 8 directions. The reason for that is that the northeast direction does not have spiritual creatures attributed to it. This is a very subtle thing, which I'd need to explain some other time. But because this is a bit confusing, I have actually drawn out a grid table and inserted it into the book. So when you get to the discussion of Tartarus, you can simply look at the table to understand it, because otherwise the Latin description weaves in and out. I find, and probably you will too, that a diagram is a much easier way of apprehending something. And so here you've got the 4 demon kings, 4 directions, etc., but you've only got 7 the other entities. And so the plan enables you to reconcile the 4 and the 7 together.
That is so lovely, especially for people who might have been scratching their heads. I would presume, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I'd imagine for hundreds of years, people said, well, hold on, Varcon Rex, what, Lemegeton's Goetia king should this go under? And it's like, no. There is this entirely other infernal hierarchy, Tartarian hierarchy. And thank you for providing that context, Dr. Skinner. That's just so incredibly valuable, I think.
This is just a comment that's, it's not a serious comment, but anybody who's been watching the word Tartarus or Tartarian online will have noticed that the adjective is now described to beautiful and old buildings as remnants of the Tartarian culture, which is, I take it you haven't noticed that online.
My goodness. No. So this is being referenced online now to describe the style of buildings in reference to
there are actually photographs of these beautiful old buildings, which are then categorized as Tartarian. Well, some of them are quite commonly known buildings, but beautiful. And so a sort of Tartarian architecture has built up. But this is one of the, not the functions of the net, but one of the sort of byproducts of it, that things like this get stuck together. Anyway, I quite like it. But the real Tartarus is not a place where bad people go. It's a place where people don't go at all, because it is purely occupied by spiritual creatures, demons, angels, spirits, etc. And in it, it's quite heavily structured. I mean, we think that humans have got a fairly detailed structure. There is, of course, a pecking order, but in the spirit world, this pecking order is much more firmly in place.
For the listeners who are familiar, of course, I hope that the connection's being made. When you recite or read the very famous in the Lemegeton's Goetia and in the Heptameron, the Berelinensis conjuration, right? Berelinensis, Baldachiensis, Paumachiae, et apologe sedis. And then it says, Ministeri Tartare sedis. So that it specifically mentions that and genealogia.
The ministers of the Tartarian thrones. Apologia, for example, is the throne in the north. So this invocation is very detailed picking, and unfortunately some of the key thrones have been left out, which was probably a fault by some scribe at some point. So I have given in this book a diagram which shows where these thrones are. This is a piece of magical culture which did not survive, except, like Alexander just said, in some of the invocations, but not as an explanation. So the SSM gives the explanation, and I've given a diagram to explain the explanation.
I know myself and the thousands and thousands and thousands of listeners, Dr. Skinner, will appreciate poring over your reconstruction and sharing of your own Tartarian architecture, if you will permit me, because you really do restore that. And I'm so very much looking forward to it. Dr. Skinner, this is a perfect time to talk about something that you brought up earlier, which is the challenging parts of actually translating the SSM. And I'll just tee this question up by saying, I think some people might have a perception of, a scholar sitting comfortably in a very nice chair, and just leisurely transcribing and translating. When I hear you describe the SSM, it sounds like you are in World War I trench warfare. I mean, this is 800 folio pages, 200,000 words. Can you share with us what were some of the most challenging parts of translating the SSM?
Well, the vocabulary for a start, because you don't find all of these terms in a classical Latin dictionary, and some of them you can find in a medieval Latin dictionary. But the actual meaning of some of them in a magical context is quite different. So teasing out what some of these mean and not doing a literal translation, but an explanatory translation was hard work, but worth doing. I have in many cases put an explanation in square brackets after the offending term, but there were still one or two that completely eluded me, so I just left them in the text in Latin. I think literally only 3 or 4 of them. Some translators would have just cut the word out or even cut the sentence out, but I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think it should be there. What were the difficulties? Well, the difficulty is that, first of all, the manuscript is fairly tiny. There are many, many words on a page. It's beautifully written. So if the guy has written an R in one place, the same pen stroke will be where it appears again, which is a blessing. But sometimes with Latin, you have minims, which is just vertical strokes, and you can have 4 in a row or even more. And it's not completely certain as to whether it is M followed by an I or I preceded by 2 N's or whatever. Sometimes they have been abbreviated and a line drawn across the top has represented 3 minims in a row, but you've still got to figure out what part of which group of letters is because of that minim. So if you think in Latin, then it's much easier. Now, I can't claim to think in Latin. I still have to think in distinct words. So that was hard. And also, for example, when I got down to the section on the 10 Kandaris, to find that they're constructed out of letters taken from 4 different alphabets and stuck together in different ways was, my God, what is this about? Is it really what it says it is, or is it something else that it's talking about? I figured it out eventually. One of the things in this first volume is there is a large register of spirits. And a delightful thing is that you can recognize a number of the spirits in the Goetia present there. So it's good to know that over 700 years, I suppose in the case of the Goetia, 500 years, not too much corruption has happened. People have been careful about the names of the spirits. Because indeed, if you can't name the spirit properly, then you can't call it. So it's just as well.
You've mentioned a few times the Kandari. And what are the Kandari?
Okay, the Kandari are originally 9, but in the SSM it's 10 standard talismans to do certain things, and these can be used later alongside of more specific talismans. But they have become a mystery, and much of the later grimoires, when they use a Kandari, get it wrong or just scribble it. That's unfortunately some of the scribes, if they can't understand it, it's just easier to scribble it. It's somewhat like modern Chinese, where some of the old detailed characters are just now marked as an X, meaning we have an idea, but we're not going to write it out in full. So it was just a pleasure to come back to a document which takes each one of these in turn, describes what it's made of, describes what it does, And so now, for the first time, I understand the Kandaris. I can't claim that I understood them before I started reading the SSM. Well, there are also a number of pieces of ritual equipment, like the corolla or the strap or the whistle. I think whistle's been talked about by Joseph Peterson, but the corolla and the strap are still probably a mystery, but these are explained here. Then we've all heard of the revolution of names, like Yod, He, Vahe, can be sliced and diced into different orders, but it's actually shown here in apparently almost three-dimensional, so that's quite interesting. There are a lot of other things there.
You might have just answered this question, Dr. Skinner, but I was just about to ask you, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered during your translation journey? And it sounds like there are many things that are illuminating the Solomonic tradition.
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing was that after having read many hundreds of grimoires, there's still so much that I didn't know.
Can I just say, for you to say that, Dr. Skinner, trust me, that means that all of us, I think, are eagerly awaiting to have your full translation to fill in the gaps. Taking a big picture look at this, now that the SSM, you are presenting it in English, starting with volume 1, which is going to be books 1 and 2 of the SSM, and volume 2 later on will be books 3 through 5. What new areas of practice and what new areas of inquiry does this bring up for scholars and also for practitioners? Like, where do you see it going from here?
Well, for practitioners, it is more orderliness, more starting in the right place and moving in the right direction. It shows magic as much more of a technique. There's much less guesstimation. There's much less approximation. So that's good. As for all the other things that are new in here, I think when I bring out volumes, which will have books 3, 4, and 5, then I can do a much more comprehensive overview of the whole thing.
Dr. Skinner, this volume 1 is, of course, being presented with yourself and Daniel Clark. Can you just share? This just popped into my head, but of course, this is not your first collaboration together. How was it working with Daniel for this collaboration?
Well, working with Daniel is a delight. Daniel has got his hands on the whereabouts of various manuscripts in which libraries and so forth. And when I need to just check a particular reference in a particular manuscript, which I don't have, I can ask Daniel and bingo, the page will turn up. Also with Daniel, he's helped with translation because he's much more software au fait than I am. And where I might use a dictionary, he will look up something else. So he's been very useful in that way. And he has kept me interested and my nose to the grindstone. And he's cleaned up all of the illustrations so that we have been very careful not to remove anything that was part of the original manuscript, but he removes all the show-through from the back, all the damage to the paper and all that sort of thing, because we don't need to see all that. You can go and have a look at the original manuscript again in digital form if you need to, but so he does that. He's just there for me to speak to when I need to know something. So he's a font of all sorts of knowledge.
Yes, he is. He's absolutely wonderful, and I'm so excited that you both were collaborating again. Of course, by now, listeners, by the time you're hearing this, there will be links available to pre-order and directly order this from Golden Horde. So check out the links below, listeners, for getting your own copy of Volume 1 of the SSM via Dr. Skinner and Daniel Clark. Dr. Skinner, dare I ask, what else are you working on at this point? What else is on your dossier?
Well, I've already hinted at that. The Antipalus is the next one that will come out.
Yes.
Which is Trithemius's list of what he thought were the 103 most important magical manuscripts. And of course, in 1508, he wasn't talking about printed books. They're almost all manuscripts. And in that, I've traced where those manuscripts have finished up. That's another reason why I work well with Daniel. He was able to track a lot of those through various twists and turns and finishing up somewhere else in a different library under a different name. So that's the next one. Beyond that, I would like to track back some of the manuscripts that Berengarii Gannellii actually used, but so far that has been an empty search.
We will keep our ear to the ground, certainly on any updates with the search, as well as your upcoming projects, Dr. Skinner. This is a monumental achievement. First time in about 700 years that this has been translated from the Latin into English.
It's been kept very secret. I mean, it has been available in the Ducal Library and in what is now the State Library of Cassel, or Hesse-Cassel. But the number of people who actually attempted it are pretty small, because it's a hell of a document. And I'm glad that eventually I got around to doing it, because it would be just so sad if all this knowledge was just put back on the shelf and forgotten about.
Well, I certainly join the thousands and thousands of listeners across the globe who very much look forward to delving the esoteric spade deep into the fruits of your research and your collaboration with Daniel Clark. Volume 1 of the Summa Sacre Magice is through Golden Horde Press, being presented by here the excellent, inimitable author, scholar, grimoire practitioner, Dr. Stephen Skinner. Dr. Skinner, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. Very much appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I'm at a loss for words, because this is incredible. It pushes our understanding of Solomonic magic even deeper into the mists of time. It fills in so many gaps, and I cannot wait, as I'm sure you are feeling the exact same way, to start pouring through Volume 1 of the full translation of the Summa Sacre Magice. This is going to be such an incredible thing to delve into, and a huge thanks to Dr. Stephen Skinner for his incredible scholarship and for sharing about this on Glitch Bottle. So listeners, please check out the podcast and video descriptions below for the latest links to pre-order your copy of the first volume of the SSM. As always, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on patreon.com/glitchbottle. You are the supporters of the podcast. You are the reason why the podcast continues to grow in new and interesting ways. So check that out if you'd like to become an exclusive member as well. This is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.